Many of us have family members who attended residential schools. Approximately 900 children from NunatuKavut communities in central and southern Labrador attended boarding schools between 1906, when the St. Anthony Orphanage opened, and 1980, when the dormitories at Northwest River closed. Most were between the ages of 6 and 16. Many of us are the descendants of these children.
Most of these children went to boarding schools that the International Grenfell Association ran in Muddy Bay, Cartwright, Northwest River, Mary's Harbour, and an orphanage in St. Anthony. There were also 2 boarding schools run by the Moravian Mission at Nain and Makkovik, but most of the NunatuKavut children went to the Grenfell institutions. The Labrador Public School at Muddy Bay, just south of Cartwright, was built in 1920 and burned down in 1928. The Lockwood School in Cartwright was built in 1930 and closed in 1964. The boarding school in Mary's Harbour, or Mary's River as it was called then, opened in 1931 and closed in 1938. The orphanage, or children's home in St. Anthony, opened in 1906 and closed in 1969. And the dormitories for the Yale School in Northwest River opened in 1926 and closed in 1980. So all of these institutions were started before Labrador became part of Canada in 1949. And so the Federal Indian Act didn't apply to them, and they were not part of the system of federal residential schools. Children as young as 5 and 6 were separated from their family, culture, and community when they came to live at these schools. They came from small settlements of a few families, so adjusting to life in a large institution was often difficult. The children had to follow strict rules and a rigid schedule, and they had chores to do at the dormitory. Teachers and the house parents would discipline children when they got in trouble. Some former students describe physical beatings, and others describe having to go without food as punishment. The children were also vulnerable to physical, psychological, and sexual abuse by staff and other students. The students had few people to protect them when they needed help. For the teachers and dormitory staff, the boarding schools were a way of removing the children from the influence of their families and community, and of transforming them by teaching them the values and behaviors of dominant white society. They imposed class and racial distinctions, values, and rules that often made the children feel inadequate and ashamed of their families and Inuit heritage. For the families, the boarding schools were often the only opportunity for education, so they didn't have much choice about sending their children away. Many children were homesick and lonely, but they had to stay at the boarding school from September to June because home was too far away. The boarding schools prevented the children from growing up surrounded by relatives and from learning about traditional Inuit practices. The experience disconnected them from their families and their culture. Many former students and their families suffered long-term impacts and trauma from their boarding school experiences for years afterwards. Depression, addiction, and mental health issues have all been directly related to traumatic childhood experiences in boarding schools. And these impacts have had devastating consequences on families and communities throughout Labrador.
Since the boarding schools closed, Inuit communities and Inuit governments have been working to develop an educational system on our own terms. Instead of having outside organizations determine our children's education, the NunatuKavut Community Council is advancing Inuit education that reflects our own needs and culture, and that keeps our children at home. Our families and our communities have endured having to send generations of children to residential schools, but we have survived and are creating a better future for our children today.